A stone road cuts through morning mist somewhere in the Rhineland, circa 120 AD. Before the sun has fully risen, a column is already moving. It stretches farther than you can see in either direction. Not soldiers at the front, not yet. First come the cavalry outriders, scanning the tree line. Then wagons loaded with grain sacks and amphoras of olive oil. Then mule trains carrying iron tools, leather goods and medical supplies. Then cattle, slow and necessary. Then engineers with surveying equipment. Then a small military escort, and behind them, more wagons. The legionary at the fortress gate watches it arrive. He does not think about glory. He thinks about whether his rations will last until the next column comes. Every single day, across approximately 4,000 kilometers of Rhine and Danube frontier, this scene repeated itself. Not during campaigns, not during emergencies. Every day, in all seasons. Through floods and frost and political chaos in Rome that these soldiers may not even have heard about yet. 100,000 soldiers by modern historical estimates, the approximate combined strength of the Rhine-Danube frontier under the Emperor Hadrian needed to eat. Every day. That works out to roughly 150 tons of grain. Every day. Not counting animal fodder, not counting olive oil, wine, leather, iron, or firewood. Not counting the food needed for the 20 to 25,000 support personnel who kept that fighting force operational. Just the grain, just the minimum. 150 tons, daily. In a world with no trucks, no refrigeration, no radio, no logistics software, no GPS to reroute a supply convoy around a flooded road. You might be thinking, this sounds exaggerated. Ancient armies foraged. They improvised. They ate what they found. Some did. Rome, at this scale, did not. What Rome built to make that number possible is one of the most extraordinary organizational achievements in human history, and almost nobody talks about it. Most people who know Roman history inside out have seen Trajan's column. They know the legions. They know the battles. They know the commanders and the campaigns and the famous defeats. What they almost never know is the invisible system that made all of it possible. The roads, the river fleets, the granaries, the tax apparatus, the career supply officers, the provincial contracts, the institutional machinery that kept 100,000 soldiers alive through rain and snow and heat, year after year, on the edge of the known world. This is about that system. Not the sword, the grain ledger. And here is what makes it matter even now. When that system finally broke, no amount of Roman courage could save what was left. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers are where the problem reveals itself. A Roman legionary in the 2nd century AD needed approximately 3,000 calories per day to function. That figure comes from modern historical reconstruction, primarily from the work of scholars like Jonathan Roth, who analyzed ancient sources, comparative dietary data, and archaeological evidence. It is somewhat less than a modern infantry soldier's requirement. The average Roman legionary was smaller and older than his contemporary counterpart, but 3,000 calories per day was still primarily grain, wheat, eaten as bread or porridge, supplemented with olive oil, dried legumes, salt fish, occasional meat, and vinegar wine. A single legion of roughly 5,000 soldiers needed, by conservative scholarly estimate, approximately 7.5 tons of grain per day. That figure excludes the olive oil. It excludes fodder for the horses and mules that the legion used for transport and cavalry. It excludes wood for cooking fires, leather for equipment repair, iron for maintaining weapons, cloth for replacing worn clothing, and the medicinal supplies that Rome's military medical service, far more sophisticated than most people realize, consumed in steady quantities. Now scale that to 100,000 soldiers. You are at approximately 150 tons of grain per day for the men alone. Add the mules, and a supply system serving 100,000 soldiers requires thousands of mules, each of which needs feeding too. Fodder requirements for pack animals are roughly equivalent in weight to the supplies they carry. The supply train begins to feed on itself. A typical pack mule, at the limits of its load capacity, could carry about 250 to 300 pounds, roughly 115 to 135 kilograms. To move a single day's grain for 100,000 soldiers by mule train alone would require over 1,000 animals at maximum load. Those animals, in turn, needed approximately 10 to 15 pounds of fodder each per day, which required more wagons, which required more animals to pull them. This is the paradox at the heart of ancient military logistics. The larger the army, the more it needs to eat. The more it needs to eat, the larger the supply apparatus required to feed it. The larger the supply apparatus, the more it eats. At some point, the system curves back on itself and begins consuming its own carrying capacity. Most ancient armies solved this problem by foraging, living off the land, requisitioning food from local populations, eating through a region, and then moving on before it was completely stripped. This worked for raiding parties and short campaigns. It was catastrophically inadequate for a standing force of 100,000 soldiers garrisoned permanently on a contested frontier. Rome understood this earlier and more deeply than any other ancient state. And Rome's response was not to accept the limitation. It was to engineer around it. Modern military planners talk about the tooth-to-tail ratio, the number of support personnel required for every combat soldier in the field. The United States Army, during operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, maintained roughly a 10-to-1 ratio. For every soldier in combat, approximately 10 more were required in support: fuel, food, maintenance, communications, medical, intelligence, transport. Modern armies are extraordinarily capable fighting machines. They are also extraordinarily supply-hungry. Rome, historians estimate, achieved closer to a 4-to-1 or 5-to-1 ratio, one support person for roughly every 4 or 5 fighters. That figure is a scholarly reconstruction and carries real uncertainty. But even allowing for that uncertainty, the comparison is striking. Rome sustained its frontier armies with a fraction of the support footprint that modern expeditionary forces require, without combustion engines, without refrigeration, without any form of electronic communication. That ratio was not achieved by accident. It was not the result of Roman soldiers being tougher or Roman generals being smarter. It was the product of a system built deliberately, refined through painful failure, and institutionalized over 3 centuries. The support efficiency was an engineering achievement as much as a military one. So the question becomes, what was the system, and how did it work? The answer has 4 parts. It has roads, it has rivers, it has stone warehouses. And it has something that most military history documentaries never reach: a political economy of supply that was, in some ways, the most sophisticated thing Rome ever built. Rome did not begin with a working supply system. It built one through failure. The first major test came during the First Punic War, which began in 264 BC. For the first time, Roman armies were fighting overseas in Sicily against Carthage, and the supply lines back to Italy were exposed, unreliable and expensive to maintain. Several campaigns suffered supply crises that had nothing to do with the enemy. Ships were lost, grain failed to arrive on schedule. Armies in the field found themselves short of the basic provisions they expected. The Second Punic War, beginning in 218 BC, provided a more brutal education. Hannibal was a logistical genius as much as a tactical one. His decision to cross the Alps and fight in Italy was partly a calculation that a Carthaginian army could live off the agricultural wealth of Roman provincial territory better than it could be reliably supplied from home. He was right for longer than Rome would have liked. Meanwhile, Roman commanders fighting in Spain discovered that supply lines stretching from Italy across the western Mediterranean were not just expensive, they were precarious. Delays in shipment, disputes in Rome about funding and allocation, and the difficulty of moving bulk food reliably by sea meant that Roman armies in Spain were repeatedly undersupplied in ways their enemies were not. There is a phrase attributed to Julius Caesar centuries later, but rooted in this tradition, that described one of his preferred strategic methods. His biographers record that Caesar often preferred to wear down his enemies rather than simply defeat them in open battle. One Roman expression for this approach translates roughly as kicking the enemy in the stomach, meaning the deliberate targeting of their food supply. Caesar understood, because Rome had learned, that you could destroy an army by starving it more reliably than by killing it. The enemy's supply line was a military objective as real as any fortress. In the late 2nd century BC, a general named Gaius Marius overhauled the Roman legion and, in doing so, embedded a logistical philosophy into the body of every soldier. Before Marius, Roman armies had relied on substantial baggage trains and a significant number of camp servants to carry equipment. Marius stripped this down. Each legionary was required to carry his own equipment and rations, a full pack that could weigh 60 pounds or more. The soldiers earned a nickname that stuck for centuries: Muli Mariani, Marius's mules. This was not cruelty, it was engineering. A soldier who carried his own food for several days moved independently of the supply wagon for short-range operations. A Marian column could cover ground faster, react more flexibly, and operate in terrain where supply wagons could not follow. The supply train became the structural layer of logistics sustaining long-term operations, while the soldier's pack became the tactical layer, the buffer that kept the individual fighting unit operational between resupply points. Then came Augustus. When Augustus reorganized the Roman state after decades of civil war, beginning around 27 BC, he turned what had been an improvised, campaign-specific supply system into a permanent institutional apparatus. The transformation was not dramatic. It happened through a series of administrative decisions that collectively changed the nature of Roman military supply from reactive to structural. He created the Praefectus Annone, a senior official whose permanent, full-time responsibility was the management of grain supply for Rome and its armies. Not a wartime emergency appointment, a standing office, with staff, with subordinates at Rome's ports, with authority to manage shipping contracts, inspect storage facilities, and regulate the grain trade. He formalized the cursus publicus, the imperial postal and transport network that turned Roman roads into a coordinated logistics system rather than a collection of independent routes. The cursus publicus operated on two tiers. Every 8 to 12 miles along major roads, a mutatio, a way station, where couriers and officials could change horses and continue. Every 20 to 30 miles, a mansio, a full overnight facility with stables, kitchens, sleeping quarters, and baths. An officer traveling with an imperial travel document could cover roughly 50 miles per day using this network. Supply wagons moved more slowly, averaging perhaps 15 to 20 miles per day, but they moved on a network specifically designed to support their movement. These changes did not make Rome's supply system perfect. Nothing in human organization is perfect, but they made it permanent. They transformed logistics from something that happened before a campaign into something that happened continuously, whether a campaign was underway or not. They embedded supply discipline into the institutional structure of the empire itself, rather than into the personality of any individual commander. That distinction between a system that depends on exceptional individuals and a system that functions independently of them is one of the most important things Rome ever got right. And it is, ultimately, the reason the supply system lasted as long as it did. By the time Hadrian inspected the Rhine frontier in 122 AD, what he was looking at was not simply a military force. It was a machine for converting the agricultural resources of a dozen provinces into sustained combat power at the edge of the known world. That machine had 3 physical components and 1 political one. The roads came first. The Roman road network is famous. What is less well understood is its actual scale. For generations, historians estimated the total network of Roman roads at roughly 120,000 kilometers of public ways. Research published in 2025, using satellite imagery, aerial photography, and newly digitized archival records from multiple countries, suggests the full network, including secondary roads, may have approached 300,000 kilometers, though the researchers are careful to note that only a small fraction of the newly mapped routes has been confirmed with archaeological precision. Even the older, lower estimate represents an engineering undertaking without parallel in the ancient world. These roads were not simply paved paths, they were engineered systems. The major military highways were built in layers, a foundation of large stones, intermediate layers of crushed gravel and compacted material, topped with fitted stone paving. They were cambered to drain rainfall to the side. They were surveyed for the straightest possible line regardless of terrain, cutting through hills, bridging rivers, crossing marshes on piled foundations. They were built by the legions themselves during peacetime construction, was a standard military duty, and maintained through a system of provincial obligation that assigned road sections to local communities. The Via Appia, begun in 312 BC during the Second Samnite War, was the first great military highway, more than 400 miles from Rome to Brindisi. By the time of the High Empire, roads bearing similar names ran from Britain to Syria, from Morocco to the Upper Danube. Roman emperors knew, as their republican predecessors had known, that a road was not just an engineering achievement, it was a strategic weapon. A road that reached the frontier before the army did was worth more than any reinforcement sent after the crisis had already begun. But roads had a physical limit. Moving bulk goods over long distances by road was slow and expensive. A wagon could carry roughly a ton of cargo. On a good road, in good conditions, it might cover 15 to 20 miles per day. The cost of road transport in the ancient world was, by scholarly calculation, significantly higher than water transport. Some historians estimate 10 to 20 times more expensive per ton-mile to move cargo by road than by river or sea. This is where the second component of Rome's supply system reveals itself, and it is the component least discussed in popular history. The rivers, the Rhine, the Danube, the Rhone, the Nile. These were not just geographic features or defensive barriers, they were the most efficient freight highways in the ancient world. A river barge loaded with grain could move more cargo in a single trip than dozens of road wagons, at a fraction of the cost. River transport required no drafted animals, no road maintenance, no relay stations, only a crew, the current moving downstream, and towpaths for the journey upstream. Rome understood this. Along the Rhine frontier, the Classis Germanica, the Rhine fleet, operated not primarily as a naval fighting force, but as a logistics and patrol fleet. These were shallow-drafted vessels designed for river navigation, able to move supplies quickly along the Rhine and its tributaries, shifting stocks to points where they were needed, reinforcing threatened sectors, and maintaining the physical connection between the string of forts along the frontier. Without control of the river, the entire supply network of the Rhine frontier would have been dependent on roads alone, and roads alone could not have sustained it. Rome also built canals, specifically to extend river connectivity. The Fossa Corbulonis connected the Rhine to the Meuse in what is now the Netherlands. A canal bypassed the dangerous Iron Gate rapids on the Danube, allowing continuous river navigation along the entire frontier length. Trajan made repairs and improvements to the ancient canal connecting the Nile to the Red Sea. These were not prestige projects. They were freight infrastructure built because the cost savings of river transport justified the engineering investment. The combination of road and river networks created what modern logisticians would recognize as a multimodal transport system. Grain from North Africa crossed the Mediterranean by sea to Ostia. River barges carried it along the coast or up the great rivers of Gaul. Road wagons took it from river landing points to major supply depots inland. River barges again from those depots to frontier forts. The final leg, from the nearest landing or depot to the fortified position by wagon or pack animal along the military roads. Each mode of transport handled the leg for which it was best suited. Sea for bulk over long distances. River for interior distribution. Road for the final connection to positions that rivers could not reach. Now comes the third component, and it may be the most important. The granaries. A supply system that delivered food reliably only when the supply chain was functioning normally was not a supply system, it was a dependency. What Rome built instead was a buffer, distributed across the empire. At every major fortress and many minor ones were storage facilities the Romans called horaea, stone-built warehouses engineered specifically for the long-term preservation of grain. Military horaea were not ordinary storerooms, they were precision engineering. The floor was raised above the ground on pillars or ventilation channels, allowing air to circulate beneath the grain, preventing the moisture and fungal growth that would destroy a supply in months. The walls were massively buttressed to bear the weight of grain stacked deep against them. Loading bays at the ends allowed wagons to pull directly alongside. The construction was designed to maintain interior conditions that preserved grain through summer heat and winter cold alike. The Housesteads fort on Hadrian's Wall, still partially visible today, gives a sense of what this meant in practice. A full cohort of roughly 480 men needed 50 to 60 tons of grain annually. The Housesteads' granaries were built to hold considerably more, a year's supply with buffer, providing the garrison operational independence from the supply chain for extended periods. The Severan supply base at South Shields, built for the Scottish campaigns of Septimius Severus, could reportedly hold enough grain for approximately 11,000 soldiers. Not a fortress, a warehouse. Built because an army that had to wait for its food was an army that could not act freely. At the scale of Rome itself, the ambition was staggering. By the late imperial period, the city maintained nearly 300 horaea to supply its own demands. The largest, the Horaea Galbae on the Aventine, covered an area comparable in scale to the Colosseum, 140 rooms on the ground floor alone. Ancient sources record, though the claim carries the rhetorical conventions of imperial praise literature and should be treated with appropriate caution, that when Septimius Severus died in 211 AD, he left Rome's warehouses stocked with enough food to supply the city's approximately 1 million inhabitants for 7 years. Even if that figure is exaggerated, and scholars believe it likely is, what it communicates is real. Rome's institutional aspiration was not simply to have enough food, it was to have so much food, so reliably stored, that no reasonable crisis could threaten the supply. The buffer was the strategy. The warehouse was the weapon. The fourth component, the one that connected roads, rivers, and granaries into a functioning whole, was the depot chain. Rome operated a layered depot system. Operational bases at major ports and river junctions accumulated supplies from multiple sources and distributed them forward. Tactical bases, closer to the front, held intermediate stocks. Smaller, guarded depots connected the layers. A legion at the frontier dispatched wagons to the nearest depot every 5 to 10 days, drawing pre-positioned supplies rather than waiting for a convoy from the rear. The supply did not travel with the army traveled to the supply. This design solved the paradox of scale. Because the depots were permanent and pre-stocked, a garrison or a marching column did not need to carry all its food at once. It carried enough for the distance to the next node. The supply train's weight remained manageable. The army remained mobile. The system scaled without consuming itself. Let's follow a single grain shipment, from field to soldier, because the abstract architecture of roads and rivers and granaries becomes something different, something almost alive when you trace it through a specific journey. It is sometime around 120 AD. A provincial estate in North Africa, southwest of what was once Carthage. The wheat harvest has come in. The grain is being gathered and weighed in a stone-floored storage building at the field's edge. A Roman official arrives with a writing tablet. He represents the state's grain collection apparatus, one of the officers responsible for ensuring that this province's supply quota reaches the military system. He counts, he marks, he verifies the quality. Part of this grain will go to licensed shipping contractors, private merchants, called naviculari, who hold state contracts to transport imperial cargo across the Mediterranean. Part will be taken directly as tax in kind, contributing to North Africa's annual military supply obligation. The navicularii were not government employees. They were businessmen. But Rome had structured their contracts so that private commercial interest and public military necessity pointed in the same direction. A contractor who delivered reliably received tax advantages, legal protections, and social prestige. One who failed to deliver faced penalties. The arrangement made the private supply network resilient in ways that a purely state-run operation would not have been, because it distributed the organizational burden across thousands of independent actors rather than concentrating it in a single bureaucracy. The grain reaches Carthage, loaded onto a ship of perhaps 300 to 400 tons capacity. Larger grain barges working the main Mediterranean lanes could exceed 1,000 tons. The shipping company has a contract with the Praefectus Annonae's office in Rome. The route, the quantity, the destination, pre-arranged. There are formal shipping documents, inspection protocols at the loading port, and official receipts at the receiving end. This is not improvisation. The ship crosses the Mediterranean. It arrives at Portus, the artificial harbour that Claudius began and Trajan completed, built specifically because the natural harbour at Ostia was inadequate for the volume of imperial supply traffic the empire now generated. At Portus, the cargo is inspected again, recorded again, transferred. Some of this grain feeds Rome, but a portion of it allocated months ago in the supply planning cycle of the Praefectus Annonae's office is designated for the Rhine frontier. It moves onto river barges, travelling up the coast and then up the Rhone, Rome's great commercial artery into Gaul. At Lugdunum, the city we now call Lyon, it arrives at a major regional supply depot, a large Horium complex staffed by supply officials, connected to both the river network and the road network, holding stocks from multiple provincial sources and distributing them forward to frontier forts along scheduled convoy routes. A supply officer at Lugdunum checks the incoming cargo against his ledger. He does not know the name of the soldier who will eat this grain. He knows his frontier allocation figures, and he knows his job is to make sure the numbers match. He is not a general. He is not famous. His name does not appear on any monument. But the supply chain he manages connects an African wheat field to a German frontier in a continuous sequence that has been planned, contracted, inspected, and recorded at every link. From Lugdunum, wagons carry the grain northeast along Roman military roads toward the Rhine. The roads are maintained by local communities, fulfilling their road obligation to the empire. At regular intervals, way stations allow wagon teams to be changed and the cargo to be recorded. The grain moves not in one continuous flow, but in relay, passed forward from node to node. It arrives at Mogontiacum, the city we now call Mainz, a major legionary fortress on the Rhine. The Praefectus Castrorum, the camp prefect who serves as the legion's senior logistics officer, inspects the incoming supply. His staff oversees the unloading and storage. The grain enters the raised floor Horium inside the fortress walls. It is not used immediately. This load is buffer weeks of supply held in reserve to ensure that the garrison can continue to function even if the next convoy is delayed by flood, by road damage, or by any of the 100 small failures that a complex system accumulates. The garrison does not eat from anxiety. It eats from abundance maintained by discipline. Eventually, on a scheduled ration day, a legionary receives his weekly grain allocation. He and his 7 tent mates take turns at the hand mill. They grind, they bake. They already carry a personal emergency supply hard-baked biscuit called bucellatum, stored in their own packs. If cut off from the fort's supply for a few days, they can still eat. That grain traveled approximately 2,000 miles from an African field. It passed through at least 5 formal administrative checkpoints. It was managed by a provincial tax official, a private shipping contractor, a port inspector, a river barge captain, a regional depot officer, a road station master, a camp prefect, a ration officer, and finally a soldier who ground it by hand in a stone mill on the edge of the known world. No single person designed this journey. No single person monitored it in full. The system managed itself because Rome had spent 3 centuries building a system that did not require a genius to operate it. It required only that everyone in the chain do their job, that contracts were honored, that roads were repaired, and that the political will existed to maintain the whole apparatus. That last requirement, political will, turns out to be the critical one. If this video is helping you see Rome differently, this is a natural moment to subscribe. There is still more than half of this story left, and the second half is where it gets complicated. On Roman imperial coinage struck during the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, a figure appears repeatedly that most modern viewers would find unexpected. Not a soldier, not a general, not an eagle or a battle scene. A woman carrying a grain measure and a cornucopia. She is labeled Annona. Rome put her on its money because feeding the empire was not, in Roman political thinking, a logistical matter. It was an imperial virtue. The emperor's capacity to ensure the grain supply for the city of Rome and for the armies at the frontier was as much a demonstration of legitimate power as military victory. The Praefectus Annonae, the supply prefect, was one of the most powerful officials in Rome who did not come from the senatorial aristocracy. He held authority over shipping contracts, storage facilities, price regulation, and the legal apparatus protecting the grain trade. He reported directly to the emperor. Managing supply was a career, not a consolation posting. At the level of the individual legion, the same logic applied. The Praefectus Castrorum, the camp prefect, was typically the most experienced officer in the legion, a man who had spent decades rising through the centurionate before reaching this post. His primary responsibility was not combat. It was everything that made combat possible: supply, construction, equipment, medical services, engineering. The best fighting generals of Rome's imperial period understood that their first obligation before any campaign was to the camp prefect's readiness report, not to their own battle plans. The provincial supply network that fed the frontier armies operated through a system that was partly political obligation, partly voluntary competition, and partly coerced contribution. Each province had an assigned quota based on its population, agricultural capacity, and proximity to military zones. Provinces rich in grain, Egypt, North Africa, Sicily, contributed food. Provinces with different resources contributed what they had. Hispania and Sardinia sent wool and clothing. Anatolia provided metals and grain. The Danube provinces supplied recruits. But this was not purely mechanical extraction. Provincial governors understood that enthusiastic compliance with supply obligations earned them imperial favor. There developed, particularly in the early imperial period, a competitive dynamic among subject peoples to exceed their quotas, deliver early, and demonstrate their reliability as supply partners. This competitive enthusiasm reduced the burden on central administration by distributing the organizational energy across dozens of independent actors. The private supply contractors, the naviculari with their shipping contracts, the negotiatores with their land-based commercial networks, were the civilian backbone of the military supply chain. Rome's most elegant institutional solution was that instead of building an entirely state-run supply apparatus requiring a massive permanent bureaucracy, it structured incentives so that private commercial activity served public military need. Reliable contractors received tax advantages and protected legal status. The state maintained regulatory oversight and the authority to compel performance. The private sector provided the flexibility, the distributed capacity, and the commercial motivation that a pure state bureaucracy could not. This system worked beautifully when two conditions held. The contracts were honored, and the payments arrived reliably. Under Septimius Severus, who came to power through civil war in 193 AD, the supply system was formalized in a new direction. The tax collection that supported military supply was increasingly codified as a direct contribution in kind grain, clothing, animals, equipment, rather than in cash. This formalization is what historians call the annona militaris, the military grain supply. It is worth being precise about what it was and what it was not. it was not a sudden invention. The practice of requiring provinces near military zones to contribute supplies directly had existed in various forms throughout the Republican and early imperial periods. What Severus formalized was the universal application of this principle and the administrative apparatus to manage it consistently across the empire. Diocletian, at the end of the 3rd century, would take it further still, systematizing it into the primary fiscal mechanism of the late Roman state. The formalization under Severus also created a new vulnerability. When soldiers were increasingly responsible for collecting their own rations directly from local populations rather than receiving them through an administrative chain with civilian oversight, the opportunity for abuse was substantial. An ancient source notes that the in-kind collection was, in many cases, enforced by detachments of troops themselves, creating, in the same breath, what it calls opportunity for horrible abuses. A taxman with a sword is not quite the same as a taxman with a ledger. The supply system that had been Rome's greatest organizational achievement was beginning, very slowly, to turn on the people who maintained it. Rome's supply system was not invincible. It had precise, identifiable failure points, moments where the architecture of roads, rivers, granaries, and provincial contracts encountered conditions it had not been designed to handle. 2 of those failure points are famous. Neither has been properly explained by most military history accounts. Both are, at their core, stories about logistics. The first is the Teutoburg Forest, September 9 AD. 3 Roman legions under the governor Publius Quinctilius Varus were moving through the forests of northwestern Germania when they were ambushed by a coalition of Germanic tribes led by Arminius. Over 4 days, in terrain that Roman military doctrine was not designed to handle, nearly 20,000 soldiers were killed. The legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, were effectively erased from the Roman order of battle. The shock reached Augustus in Rome. Ancient sources record the emperor beating his head against the doorframe of his house, shouting for Varus to give him back his legions. The usual explanation for Teutoburg focuses on betrayal. Arminius had served in the Roman army as an auxiliary, earned Roman citizenship, and used his intimate knowledge of Roman tactics to orchestrate the ambush. This is true, and it matters. But it is not the whole story. Varus was moving with the wrong logistical footprint for the terrain he was entering. His column was not configured for a military operation in hostile territory. It carried a civilian-style baggage train, personal wagons, servants, families of camp followers, market traders who had attached themselves to the march in the expectation of a routine administrative movement through a pacified province. The column stretched for miles. It moved at the pace of its slowest wagon. In open terrain, with roads, with known supply points, this was manageable. In the narrow corridor between a low sandstone ridge and a reed bog in the forest terrain, Arminius had specifically chosen, it was fatal. The Roman supply system worked in prepared terrain. It required roads for the wagons. It required cleared sight lines for the cavalry. It required known river crossings and supply depots within reach. The Teutoburg forest had none of these. Arminius had not simply chosen good ambush terrain. He had chosen terrain that stripped the Roman column of every advantage the supply system provided, while preserving for his own warriors the terrain advantages that Germanic forest fighters understood far better than any Roman general. Varus allowed the column to be encumbered by baggage and non-combatants in a situation that demanded speed and flexibility. When the ambush began, the column could not react as a military unit. It could barely move. Units separated by the terrain and the chaos of the attack could not support one another. The command structure dissolved. The supply train that was supposed to sustain the legion became, instead, the obstacle that prevented it from fighting its way out. The aftermath is as instructive as the disaster itself. Rome did not respond to Teutoburg by rebuilding its army and trying to push the frontier to the Elbe as originally planned. It responded by intensifying the supply system. The Rhine became the permanent boundary. Permanent stone fortresses were constructed at regular intervals along the river, not temporary marching camps, but durable bases designed for decades of continuous occupation. Permanent stone-built horia were constructed at each fortress. The military roads of the Rhine hinterland were improved and extended. The entire frontier became, over the following generation, a region of permanent supply infrastructure rather than a zone of temporary military presence. Teutoburg taught Rome that the supply system was not a preparation for military presence. The supply system was the military presence. Without it, there was no frontier, only soldiers in the dark. The second case study is further in time and, in some ways, more tragic. In the spring of 363 AD, the Emperor Julian departed Antioch with one of the most carefully prepared military expeditions in late Roman history. Julian was one of the most intellectually accomplished men ever to hold the Roman purple. He was a philosopher, a writer, a reader of military history. He had studied Caesar and Trajan. He understood, better than most of his contemporaries, the mechanisms of Roman power. And he was about to make a decision that would kill him and help unravel Rome's strategic position in the east. Julian's target was the Sasanian Persian Empire, ruled by Shapur II. Rome and Persia had been sparring across the Euphrates frontier for generations. Julian wanted to resolve the conflict decisively, to achieve the kind of sweeping eastern victory that would cement his legitimacy and satisfy the Roman Senate's appetite for triumphalism. His preparations were remarkable. An army of approximately 65,000 soldiers by most modern estimates, though sources vary and some push the figure higher. A river fleet of over 1,000 vessels to provide logistical support along the Euphrates. Grain ships, siege equipment, transports, medical supply barges, engineering material. The fleet was not a bonus. It was the spine of the campaign's supply system. Without it, 65,000 men moving through Mesopotamia in early summer heat could not be sustained. The early campaign went well. Roman forces moved down the Euphrates, took several fortified positions, and defeated a Persian field army outside the walls of Ctesiphon, the Sasanian capital, in modern-day southern Iraq. The Romans won that field engagement. They stood, briefly, within sight of the capital's walls. What they could not do was take it. Ctesiphon's defenses were formidable. Julian's army had left its heavy siege equipment behind. Without it, and without the time a proper siege required, taking the city was not possible. Shapur II had meanwhile been implementing a scorched earth policy across the Mesopotamian interior. Persian governors had been ordered to burn unharvested crops, destroy granaries, and demolish villages along the Roman line of advance. Persian cavalry continuously harassed Roman foraging parties, preventing the army from supplementing its supplies from the land. The fleet was carrying Julian's food. The land had been deliberately emptied of food. Julian faced a choice. Retreat north along the Tigris toward Roman territory, using the fleet to supply the march. Or continue pressing the campaign deeper into a stripped landscape. He chose neither option as described. On or about June 16, 363 AD, Julian ordered his supply fleet burned. More than 70 transport and supply vessels were destroyed. 12 lighter craft were spared for scouting. The Tigris, for a night, was on fire. The reasons for this decision are debated among historians. Ancient sources, including the eyewitness account of Ammianus Marcellinus, suggest a combination of tactical reasoning, denying the ships to the Persians, and a characteristic act of will. Julian was making a gesture. He was demonstrating commitment. He was emulating, consciously and deliberately, the tradition of commanders who burned their boats to tell their armies that there was no turning back. The problem was that in this specific situation, turning back was precisely what was required. The fleet was not a retreat option. It was a food source. With the land stripped bare by Persian scorched earth policy and foraging parties being cut down by Persian cavalry, Julian's army had destroyed the one logistical asset that could have sustained a controlled withdrawal. The retreat that followed was agonizing. The army moved north through ruined countryside with dwindling provisions. Persian cavalry conducted relentless harassment. Roman soldiers, short of food in summer heat, weakened progressively. Julian died on June 26, 363 AD, not at Ctesiphon, not in a great set-piece battle, but in a rearguard skirmish along the Tigris during a desperate march back toward Roman territory. He was struck by a spear. He died the following morning. The peace treaty that followed surrendered territories Rome had held for generations. Julian was not a fool. He was not ignorant of Roman logistics. He had studied Trajan, who had conquered Dacia and pushed into Parthia precisely because he built his supply infrastructure before he committed his forces, who had constructed Apollodorus's great bridge over the Danube, specifically to ensure a continuous supply corridor that could not be cut by seasonal river conditions. Julian knew this. He chose to act differently. That choice is the lesson. The Roman supply system was not a guarantee. It was a design, a set of principles and structures that had to be followed to provide the protection they were designed to provide. A general who understood the design and chose to override it for a gesture was not protected by his understanding. He was destroyed by his departure from it. The fire on the Tigris was not just a tactical mistake. It was a demonstration, in a single act, of what happened to Roman armies when the supply system was removed. Julian's soldiers did not stop being Roman soldiers when the fleet burned. They stopped being a sustainable military force. The fire on the Tigris happened in 363 AD. By then, something else had already been burning for more than a century slowly, without visible flame, in budget offices and tax ledgers and road maintenance accounts across the Roman West. The crisis of the 3rd century ran from 235 to 284 AD. In those 49 years, the Roman Empire had, by some reckonings, more than 50 emperors. Most of them died violently. Civil war consumed the military resources that were supposed to defend the frontiers. Invasion consumed the frontier territories that were supposed to generate the tax revenue that funded the military. The currency was debased repeatedly, as emperors facing impossible fiscal shortfalls cut the silver content of Roman coins to manufacture the money they needed. By the middle of the 3rd century, the standard silver coin contained perhaps 2 to 5% silver. The rest was copper. Inflation followed. The private supply contractors, the navicularii, the negotiatores, the provincial merchants whose participation in the imperial supply network depended on being paid reliably in currency with predictable value, found that their contracts were being settled in money that bought less each year. Some renegotiated. Some redirected their capacity toward more reliable markets. The commercial fabric that had made Rome's military supply network flexible and resilient began to fray. Diocletian's reforms at the end of the 3rd century partially stabilized the situation. He systematized the annona militaris into a universal tax-in-kind system in which provincial populations contributed grain, animals, clothing, and equipment directly rather than paying taxes in coin. This solved the inflation problem for military supply. You cannot debase a sack of grain. It also transferred the organizational burden of supply procurement from the market to the state, replacing the incentive-based private contractor network with a system of compulsory contribution enforced by an expanded Roman bureaucracy. Diocletian's system worked, for a time, but it worked by consuming the provincial economy that sustained it. Direct in-kind extraction, enforced by government officials and sometimes by soldiers themselves, did not carry the self-regulating efficiency of market-based supply. Soldiers collecting their own rations from civilian communities were not audited the way contracted merchants were. The excesses that resulted over-collection, extortion, the simple pressure of armed men demanding more than their quota slowly impoverished the agricultural communities that were simultaneously the empire's tax base and its food source. The roads began to go unrepaired, not all at once, not dramatically. The maintenance obligations that had kept the stone-paved highways in usable condition were funded through provincial taxation and organized through the cursus publicus. As fiscal pressure intensified under the weight of civil war and increasing military costs, the maintenance budget was among the first things to be cut. Roads that had been engineered to last centuries required ongoing maintenance to stay at their design performance level. Without that maintenance, they remained passable for years and then deteriorated rapidly. A rut that was not repaired became a hole. A bridge abutment that was not shored up collapsed in the next spring flood. The granaries followed the same pattern. Not empty, not yet, but less reliably stocked than the system required. A frontier garrison that had been accustomed to holding a year's supply in reserve might find itself, a decade later, holding 3 months. The buffer that had provided operational independence eroded imperceptibly, season by season, until the garrison was living supply cycle to supply cycle with no margin for disruption. In 439 AD, the Vandals captured Carthage. Rome lost North Africa. This was not simply a military defeat, it was a supply catastrophe. North Africa, the agricultural hinterland of Carthage, the great wheat-producing region that had supplied the Western Roman army and the city of Rome for 6 centuries, was gone. The Western Empire had lost its primary grain source. The supply chain that ran from African fields to the Rhine frontier, that had sustained 100,000 soldiers through the High Empire, had been severed at its root. The Western Army's ability to maintain its frontier garrisons collapsed within a generation. Not immediately, these things never happen immediately, but the mathematics were inexorable. An army that cannot be fed cannot fight. An army that cannot fight cannot defend. A frontier that cannot be defended cannot protect the provinces that might otherwise fund the army. The structure of collapse, once it began, followed the same loop that had been running in reverse during the centuries of Roman military supremacy. Political instability produced fiscal failure. Fiscal failure produced contractor flight and road decay. Road decay and underpayment produced undersupply. Undersupply reduced military effectiveness. Reduced military effectiveness invited greater external pressure. Greater external pressure produced deeper political instability. In the ascent phase of the Roman Empire, this loop ran forward. Stability produced fiscal health. Fiscal health produced reliable supply. Reliable supply produced military effectiveness. Military effectiveness reinforced political stability. The supply system was the flywheel. Keep it spinning, and the rest spun with it. In the collapse phase, the same loop ran in reverse. And the hardest thing about it is that the loop began reversing not when the empire was obviously failing, but during what appeared to be periods of relative stability. The road maintenance budgets were cut during years when the empire seemed to be recovering. The contractor payment delays happened during administrations that believed they were managing the fiscal situation responsibly. The granary stock levels declined during periods when the frontier was quiet enough that nobody noticed until the quiet ended. The Roman supply system did not fail because Rome was attacked. It failed because Rome, gradually and almost invisibly, stopped paying for it. So let's return to the question the title asks. No modern army could do this? The comparison requires precision. Modern armies are not less capable than Rome in any absolute sense. The United States Army, the British Army, the armies of a dozen modern states operate supply chains of staggering technological sophistication. GPS-tracked convoys, refrigerated container ships, automated inventory management, real-time communication between every node in the chain. If you measure by technology, by speed, by caloric delivery per soldier per day, by medical support, by equipment availability, modern militaries exceed Rome's capabilities in every dimension. But the title was never really asking about technology. The question underneath the provocative framing is about something different. It is about institutional durability, about the capacity to sustain a military supply system continuously across multiple generations without the support of superior technology dependent entirely on human organizational discipline, political will, and the accumulated institutional memory of a civilization. In that specific, narrow dimension, Rome did something that modern expeditionary forces have consistently struggled to replicate. Not because modern armies lack technical tools, they have far better ones, but because Rome had something that modern expeditionary operations often lack: The supply infrastructure was already there before the army arrived. The roads were built. The granaries were pre-stocked. The depot chain was in place. The contractors had long-term relationships with the state. The supply officers were career specialists who had spent decades mastering their craft. The provincial governors knew their quotas and delivered them. Modern armies deploying to unfamiliar theaters must build this infrastructure as they go, or depend on the willingness of allies to provide it. Rome's frontier armies didn't build the system, they inhabited one that had been built for them, refined for them, and maintained for them by 3 centuries of institutional investment. That is what the title means. That is what Rome did that no expeditionary force, ancient or modern, has matched in its specific combination of scale, permanence, and self-sufficiency. And here is the other half of the answer. Rome lost it. Not to any enemy, not to any plague or drought or technological failure. Rome lost its supply system because it stopped treating the maintenance of that system as a non-negotiable political obligation. Because the budget for road maintenance was treated as discretionary when the fiscal pressure came. Because contractor payment delays were tolerated during periods of political instability, because the granary stock levels were allowed to decline a little each decade, because the frontier was quiet enough that nobody noticed until the quiet ended. The most powerful military machine the ancient world had ever produced was not defeated by any army. It was defeated by an accounting decision, made slowly, over generations, by men who probably believed they were managing the situation responsibly. 100,000 soldiers on the Rhine and Danube needed to eat every day. For nearly 300 years, they did. The system that moved their grain across a continent, from African fields to river barges, to stone roads, to raised floor granaries on the edge of the world, worked because enough people, in enough places, kept choosing to maintain it. When they stopped, the soldiers on the frontier felt it first, not as a defeat, as a thinning, a ration that arrived late, a wagon that could not be replaced, a road that was slower than it used to be. Rome did not fall in a day. It eroded over decades, one missed grain delivery at a time. And by the time anyone fully understood what was happening, there was no longer enough of the system left to save it. Which failure do you think was more preventable, the Teutoburg disaster, where a Roman column marched into terrain the supply system couldn't support, or Julian's decision to burn his own fleet? The argument, either way, says something about whether you think Rome's supply failures came from ignorance or from pride. Leave your answer below.